All right, so in the last video, we learned how to use reduce with promises with very basic examples. Now we're actually going to do a real API fetch call. And I'll show you how that works with reduce and why it's so useful. Okay. All right. So let's see. Let's talk about this API. So this API with this query right here, whatever string I type in here, like cat, dog, or whatever, it will return an object with a movie title and some extra data about the movie with my title, right? Okay, so let's write a function for this. Function, what am I gonna call this? Let's call this get movies by titles. Okay. So we're making fetch and we're using async await. So remember, you need to prepend async in front of the word function. And right now it's going to take no arguments, but later on I'll show you how to do it so that it takes unlimited arguments as well. Okay, so right here I'm just going to keep it simple. Our titles that we want to search for, let's say cat, dog, and let's say duck. Yeah. So we want to loop through, make these API calls 3 times, right? One for cat, one for dog, and one for duck. And then in the end, we want it all returned as an array of objects for us. Okay. All right. So now what are we going to do? Well, we're going to return the result of reduce, right? But since this is async, we have to await it. Await what? Titles dot reduce. And remember, as in our previous videos, it takes in the accumulator, the initial value. But in this case, I'm going to rename init to just next title, because it's just going to loop through these, and that's a title, and that's a title, and that's a title. Okay. All right. But now, what would the second argument be? So remember our last video, when we're working with promises and reduce, we're going to use promise.resolve. Okay. And you can also use the async function call method if you want, that we talked about too. And also, I'll talk about a third way later on. Okay, so now what? What do we want our promise to resolve to? Well, we want it to resolve to an array, right? Because in the end, we want an array of objects, an array of movies, if you will. Okay, so what are we going to do first thing inside of here? Well, first of all, we have to await this promise. Okay, so const, let's call this final movies array is going to be equal to what? Await accumulator. Let me explain this. Since this is an async function, right? And we're also dealing with promises, our second argument of reduce has to be a promise. But we also want it to be an array, because that's what we want at the end, right? So we're going to call promise.resolve, resolving the initial promise to an array. Okay. And since resolve returns this empty array wrapped in a promise wrapper, so it's a promise. Because it's a promise, we have to await it. Okay. So const final movies array equals await ACC. Okay. And then now we're going to fetch, right? So const, let's call this fetch call data is equal to fetch. And then I'm just going to copy in this whole thing right here. Okay. And instead of this, what am I going to put here? Next title. Okay. And since fetch returns a promise, we have to await it. Okay. Okay, so now we get back the raw data, right? But we can't use it, so we have to convert that raw data into a format that we can use. That's when we do the .json method. So const return, let's call this parsed data is equal to what? Await fetch call data.json. Why? Because the .json from this also returns a promise, so we have to await it. Okay, so now we have the data, so we can just do final movies array. It's an array now, dot push. And then what are we pushing in? We're going to push in the parsed data. Okay. And then down here, we're going to call get movies by title. Okay. Now, we get an error here. It says await is only valid in async functions. But we have one here. So why are we getting that error? Well, it's because if you look here, reduce accepts a callback function. And this function also needs the keyword async in front of it, like this. Okay. All right. Now, why is there an error? Cannot read properties of undefined reading push. So that means we're going to go to this line. Why is this not working? What's wrong with our reduce code right now? Remember in reduce, whatever object or array that you're working on, after every iteration, you better return it. So we're going to return final movies array. Okay, now we have no more error. But how do we look at our result? Well, all of this returns what? Returns a promise, right? So calling this returns a promise. And at the end of that promise, when it's resolved or fulfilled, what we get back in the return value is this array, right? And that array will be available on the .then method that we call. Okay. Remember, for promises, when you resolve, whatever your final return value is, that's passed in as the argument right here. So we have the data, and then we're going to console.log data, see what we get. Okay, so we get 3. We get the movie cat. So there's an actual movie just called cat and an actual movie just called dog. But the closest one to the title of duck was a movie called Duck Soup. 1933. That's amazing. All right. Now, let's talk about why all of this works.